we take questions? Yes. If you would stand up, we're going to repeat the question on a microphone, and I'm going to stand up here to repeat it so that people can hear what your question was. And if you could just identify yourself. Thank you.
I'm Beverly Barnhart. I'm the department chair for WMD at the National Intelligence University.
Okay.
And my question is, if the JCPOA is not a bilateral agreement between the U.S. and Iran, so why is everyone worried first that it's going to collapse, and why can't Congress pass a law that says we still are going to abide by it?
Okay. If we could take that briefly, because we're now pretty far from the focus of this group. Okay. I don't want this thing hijacked, so if someone can answer that concisely.
They could.
Okay.
They probably won't.
Well, actually, you will. Go ahead.
No, that was the answer.
What's that?
Congress could do that, and they probably won't.
There you go. That's a model of consideration.
Let me just say one word about congressional powers and giving things up. People may have forgotten, but at the time that the NNPA was written and passed, and for a couple of years afterward, the law had one-house vetoes scattered throughout the text of the law in places where the president had certain authorities to do certain things. Congress wanted to make sure that Congress could overturn the president's decision. If you go through an early version of the NNPA, which you can find, you will see that the issue of one-house vetoes is ultimately brought to the Supreme Court, came about partly because of what was written in the NNPA. And then the law was amended after the Supreme Court decision in order to turn all the one-house vetoes into two-house vetoes. So Congress was very aggressive in trying to enforce its authority in those days. It has changed its mind since, unfortunately, in my view.
It's somewhat reassuring to know the Supreme Court exists and they don't see things just as policy. I mean, in other words, I think they actually were correct in making that ruling.
Well, I'm not saying it went ground. I'm just using that as an example of where the Congress was in terms of enforcing its own
But
authority.
it was INS v. Chadha.
Yes.
They struck down a particular congressional veto. And some folks think that if there's a different way of devising that could be a pretty useful mechanism here, including in this kind of a case.
Yes, could you identify yourself?
Chip Martin, representative Mercy Captain's office.
Okay.
So, U.S. is, when the Atomic Energy Act was written and when this was amended, the U.S. was one of the very few actors that had this kind of technology. Now, this technology is available from many other places. Shouldn't we be focusing on an international protocol that requires anyone that sells nuclear technology to anyone that doesn't have it? There should be this kind of a gold standard written into an international agreement.
All right. So the question was, wouldn't it make sense for the suppliers to be bound by some rules rather than us trying to work the rules through our laws? Was that roughly it? I mean, maybe it may not be an either or, but wouldn't you want to do both at least?
No, I think that does make a lot of sense, but there's a little bit of history about this too, because you remember that the nuclear suppliers came into existence in 1974. The NNPA was enacted in 1978, and it took 14 years before the suppliers agreed to adopt full-scope safeguards as a recommended criterion for nuclear agreements from the suppliers. So I don't have a lot of confidence that the suppliers are prepared to be way out front of this.
That said, there was a remark by Sandy Spector at a gathering, I think at Gabby, where he pointed out that the number of suppliers in the world for uranium feed for making nuclear fuel were really very, very few. Uranco, Russia, and then, almost like drops off. It might be possible to get them to agree to some conditions for what is subsequently done with their material. There aren't many, was his point. So you raise an interesting point. And, not everything has to be done by treaty. Sometimes you can just talk to people and say, what do you think? So there may be some room for that, he argued at least. Looking, yes, Mr. Countryman.
If you'll permit, Henry, a very brief comment instead of a question. I realize that changing legislation that's 40 or 60 years old shouldn't be done only with a view on today's situation. But for me, a declaration from Saudi Arabia of interest in acquiring nuclear weapons, combined with an administration that seems unable to say no to the Saudis on any issue, is sufficient reason as a matter of policy, not constitution, to pass this amendment today.
Well, you're entitled to your view, but that's not really the purpose of this gathering. There was a question? Yes.
I'm Dave Freeman. Henry can tell you who I am. But Mr. Weiss, the answer to your third point, which is that a nation that does not have nuclear power, our aid to them should be with renewables only. Is that still the law?
Yes, it is. It's never been implemented, however, so you can put things on the books that don't have any force behind them. If an administration
And
refuses,
the Obama administration
did nothing.
Well, that should be publicized.
Henry has tried it.
It's still the law.
Well,
of course, the environmental community
yeah.
is dead in terms of activity.
You're,
important.
Mr. Freeman is the former head of the TVA, which was a pretty large nuclear utility in its time, still is. Title V requires certain reports. These have been eliminated as required reports. I managed to get money to implement a dry run on the outside of government. What would the report look like if it was filed? By the way, it isn't law that you don't have to. It's law now that you don't have to, but it isn't law that you can't. We've chosen not to. The reports are audits that would be done of developing countries to see to what extent they could economically meet their energy and environmental requirements without additional nuclear power. We've done studies, and they're on the web. Actually, 2 of them are in here, if you pick these up, on Iran and Saudi Arabia. We did one on Taiwan and China, and that'll be released later.
If I understand Mr. Weiss correctly, our government ought to be talking to Saudi Arabia about solar power and not even discussing any kind of a nuclear program. Am I?
Yes. Well, bottom line is, good luck. Yes. Stand up.
Hi, my name is John Russell. I work in the Office of Senator Deans. I'm just curious if there's a risk that technology will outrun policy. Sort of the barrier to entry for nuclear technology has gotten lower because the nuclear technology itself is so old. So as countries that may not previously have been interested in nuclear technology seem to enter into it.
Could we, a front row, could we? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, so the question is, will technology potentially outrun policy? And will some of these nations be interested to develop their own technology rather than trying to buy from us?
I mean, I think that's a metaphysical question that Churchill struggled with and H.G. Wells did. The rejoinder is yes, but of course, and that's the reason we have to redouble our efforts like good fanatics to try to get a grip on it. As far as the United States being the sole speed bump in the world, no. Actually, you know, people forget it. We're afraid that the Russians are going to sell to the Saudis. You know, they claim, I don't think, we exaggerate how much importance this has, but they at least claim that they want to take the spent fuel back. I don't know that they really ever will. But we shouldn't assume that no one else is interested in restraining the spread of nuclear weapons but the United States. I think that probably is a mistake. I mean, you know, just roughly.
Well,
But-
Iraq used the calutrons, if you remember. That was the very first, oldest, least efficient technology, and caught everybody by surprise. I mean, there has been thought that new enrichment technologies such as, the Silex system that GE was developing could be incredibly efficient and easy to, and hard to prevent the spread of, and of course, reprocessing technologies such as pyroprocessing have been said the same things about, so there is that concern, but in the past we've certainly seen proliferation with other technologies.
I mean, I suppose the point is, yes, it is easier to hide things. It's much easier to acquire things. But that makes it important to get people to at least be on record in some legally binding way saying what they are going to do. And what's interesting is the people we mistrust the most spend the most time worrying about these words. The North Koreans, the Iranians, the Saudis all spend a lot of time negotiating about those words. So that brought a smile to your face. We're not dead yet. Maybe that's the best I can say on that. But you've raised a good point.
But there hasn't been a single example, however, of a country past the United States, at least our own nuclear program during World War II, that has in fact managed to go ahead and build nuclear weapons purely on the basis of technology which they internally developed in an autarkic way. Everybody else received a great deal of help from somebody else.
Yes. Was there someone? No, I think Ms. Cook. Ms. Cook.
Thank you, Henry. I'm sorry I came late, but could you, if it's necessary, repeat what you said before about the Saudi NCA and where it stands right now in terms of when it's going to be signed and why the Saudis seem to be bumping at it, or what?
I'm going to spare everyone the repetition of my wit. It's recorded. It's going to be on the web.
Oh, okay.
You can watch. So we'll take care of you later.
Thank you.
Kingston.
Kingston Reef with the Arms Control Association. Len, it's great to see you again. A number of arguments have been made in opposition to the legislation offered by Representative Ross Layton and Representative Shervin in previous iterations of it. That it will undermine the competitiveness of the U.S. nuclear industry, that it will undermine the reliability of the United States as a nuclear supplier, that it will undermine U.S. nonproliferation influence, that it will undermine U.S. influence over safety, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As you probably recall, a number of similar arguments were made with respect to the Nonproliferation Act, which you helped write. So I'm wondering, with the benefit of hindsight, would you say that those arguments made at the time, did they turn out to be true? Was that the impact of the Nonproliferation Act? And do you think that the arguments that are being leveled that I just described against the current version of the legislation hold water? Thanks.
I guess repeat once again what arguments you're specifically referring to.
So a number of arguments are being made in opposition to revising the Atomic Energy Act to include stronger non-proliferation safeguards, that this will undermine the competitiveness of the U.S. nuclear industry, make it harder for the U.S. nuclear industry to get business. It will undermine U.S. non-proliferation influence with these countries. It will undermine the reliability of the United States as a nuclear supplier.
Yeah, those arguments, have now gotten so old, I'm amazed that anybody pays attention to them anymore. But that was, in fact, what was happening when the NNPA was being drafted and was being considered on the floor, and we had to go through a pretty hard debate on the floor in order to get it passed because of those arguments. And I personally had a number of run-ins with lobbyists for the nuclear industry who were threatening to, not only threatening me personally, but threatening not being able to pass any legislation of this sort unless we absolutely paid attention to and adopted amendments to the legislation that the nuclear industry wanted. And the basis of it was that they felt very confident that in fact their arguments would hold water because of the amount of money that they were spreading through congressional contributions. And in the end, it didn't work because people felt that national security was more important than some of the contributions that they were receiving from the industry. And the legislation made a great deal of sense to people logically, so we were able to overcome all those things. But it was a fight, and I have to say that if it had taken place maybe a few years later than it did at the time, maybe the outcome might have been a bit different, but fortunately it happened when it did.
For what it's worth, there is a piece that was done by Jody Lieberman. Is it the American Physical Society or is it AAAS? I always get confused what her former perch was. It's CSIS, I believe. CSIS. You look it up. She takes on the arguments and tries to recast them in different time periods, but they're the same arguments. So you don't have to agree with her analysis, but at least it's an analysis of that. Okay, you are last.
Oh, thank you. Paul Sutherland from Santa Barbara. I was wondering if it's not too off topic to get any insights from you and the panel on nuclear proliferation and the situation in the Korean Peninsula. We thought it's been discussed Saudi Arabia's response to recent events, but I'm wondering if there's any insights that you might have.
Actually, I'm glad you asked. Spent $500,000 traveling to East Asia for 5 years, talking to people. If you're biting your nails about North Korea, let me give you something bigger to worry about. What if I was to tell you that each one of these countries that is neighboring North Korea has debates quietly going on about whether they should develop nuclear weapons options, and that the key vehicle in the case of South Korea and Japan would be the civil sector, and you guessed it, reprocessing and enrichment that currently is safeguarded under the NPT. And in the case of China, well, we are arguing about how many hundred weapons they have. If they wanted to become a peer competitor with Russia or the United States, and people debate whether they want that, there's one bottleneck, and that is plutonium. The way you could close that is get a fast reactor program and stockpile material for 10 years. It would be 10 to 20,000 bombs worth of plutonium. So it's a live issue, and I think one of the reasons North Korea is so important is it could be the ignition plug for this larger kind of rivalry. Nuclear power, surely, but it would be nice if we could back off these other two activities. And it's something which I'm hoping this administration, as it tries to do something with North Korea, will perhaps pay some attention to. And there's some reason to believe they might.
Somebody should write a book on that, Henry.
Yeah, now we will close out with an advertisement. Many of you may have gotten this. Please let me know what you think of it. If there are things in here that don't make sense or you think are wrong, let me know. I get to revise it at will. Second, this just came out. This is called Reactor-Grade Plutonium and Nuclear Weapons, Exploding the Myths. It's by someone who was very close to the man I studied under, Albert Wohlstetter. Used to work as an analyst at a place I'm supposed to never mention, so you'll have to look in here and find out where he works. In any case, very interesting book. It has an introduction by Olli Honenen, who knows a thing or two about plutonium. And then finally, we put together the analyses that we've done on Title V for Iran and Saudi Arabia, and put together some of the other things that Victor Galinsky and I have written free. And on that note, don't forget, if you're interested in signing up for the course, if you're a full-time government journalist or diplomat, to consider it. We will be taking applications, I believe, through the next month or so. And on that note, you guys have been very, very attentive. I didn't see too many people leave.